Throughout history, royal marriages have been transactions of power contracts signed with rings and consummated with duty, where love was a luxury few could afford and happiness even rarer. The palaces glittered with gold and silk, but behind their walls lived men and women trapped in gilded cages, their lives dictated by bloodlines, by politics, by the relentless machinery of empire. But some royal marriages became something darker still, chambers of betrayal, illness, and slow destruction. There was a princess born into one of Europe's wealthiest dynasties, a girl groomed from childhood to wear a crown. At 16 years old, she was married off to the heir of the greatest empire on the continent. The newspapers called it a fairy tale. Vienna celebrated with bells and champettes. But within hours of saying her vows, she would discover the nightmare that awaited her. Her husband would infect her with a disease that rendered her barren at 22. He would spiral into madness and depression, haunting the palace halls like a ghost. And on a freezing January morning in 1889, he would be found dead alongside his teenage mistress in a hunting lodge, a murder-suicide that would shake the foundations of European monarchy. She was Princess Stéphanie of Belgium, Crown Princess of Austria-Hungary, the woman who should have been empress. Charming in public, broken in private, and condemned to live in the shadow of tragedy for the rest of her 81 years. This is her story. On May 21, 1864, in the opulent royal palace of Laeken, just outside Brussels, a second daughter was born to the Duke and Duchess of Brabant. They named her Stéphanie Clotilde Louise Herminie Marie Charlotte, a name heavy with the weight of royal expectation, drawn from godparents and relatives scattered across the thrones of Europe. Her father was Prince Leopold, heir to the Belgian throne, son of Leopold I, the man who had founded the Belgian monarchy just 33 years earlier in 1831. Her mother was Archduchess Marie Henriette of Austria, a Habsburg princess whose bloodline traced back centuries through the great dynasties of Europe. On paper, Stéphanie was born into privilege beyond imagining. In reality, she entered a family already fracturing under the weight of its own misery. The marriage of Leopold and Marie Henriette had been purely political, arranged in 1853 to strengthen ties between the young Belgian kingdom and the powerful Austrian Empire. But from the beginning, they were catastrophically mismatched. Leopold was cold, calculating, obsessed with business and colonial expansion. Marie Henriette was artistic, passionate, outspoken, a woman who loved horses and music, who found her husband's mercantile mind unbearably dull. He criticized her constantly. She retreated into herself. They lived increasingly separate lives, bound together only by duty and the children they produced with mechanical regularity. Stéphanie's earliest years were shaped by this dysfunction. Her father showed little interest in his daughters, reserving all his attention for their older brother, Prince Leopold, Duke of Brabant, the precious male heir upon whom the dynasty's future rested. Her mother, meanwhile, grew distant and cold, her warmth eroded by years of unhappiness. The only consistent affection Stéphanie received came from their nanny, a woman named Tony, whose tenderness stood out like a candle in the darkness of the palace. Then, in December 1865, when Stéphanie was just 18 months old, her grandfather, King Leopold I, died. Her father ascended the throne as Leopold II, transforming the family's position overnight. They were no longer merely royalty, they were the reigning house of Belgium. But the elevation brought no happiness, only increased scrutiny and pressure. The first great tragedy struck in January 1869, when Stéphanie was 4.5 years old. Her brother, the young Duke of Brabant, just 9 years old, fell into a pond on the palace grounds. He was pulled out alive, but developed pneumonia in the brutal winter cold. For weeks, the family watched helplessly as the boy struggled to breathe, his small body racked with fever. On January 22, 1869, he died. The loss shattered what remained of the royal marriage. Leopold II, consumed with rage and grief, blamed his wife for not watching the boy closely enough. Marie Henriette, devastated, blamed herself. The first event that was deeply engraved in my memory, Stéphanie would write decades later, was the death of this beloved brother. Desperate for another male heir, because only sons could inherit the Belgian throne, Marie Henriette became pregnant again. A court held its breath. Surely this time God would grant them a prince. But when the child was born in 1872, it was another girl, Clementine. After that birth, Leopold II and Marie Henriette never reconciled. They lived in separate wings of the palace, spoke rarely, and gave up all pretense of affection. Leopold turned his attention to mistresses so many that his subjects mockingly called him Le Roi des Belges et des Belles, the king of the Belgians and of the beauties. More significantly, he turned his gaze toward Africa, toward the vast territory of the Congo that he would soon claim as his personal property. Through forced labor, torture, and systematic brutality, he would extract a fortune in ivory and rubber from the Congolese people, an empire of horror that would cost millions of lives and make him one of the wealthiest men in the world. Stéphanie's inheritance, the money that funded her palaces and her jewels, would be soaked in blood. The royal children lived under harsh discipline. When Stéphanie misbehaved, she was punished with cruelty that seemed designed to break her spirit. She was made to kneel on dried peas for hours until her knees bled. She was locked in pitch-black chambers between double doors, left alone in the suffocating darkness until she learned obedience. The only moments of warmth came from Tony, the nanny, and during feast days, Easter, St. Nicholas Day, Christmas, when the family briefly pretended at happiness. Then, in 1871, another disaster struck. Europe was still gripped by waves of epidemic disease, typhus, smallpox, the dreaded Blue Death of cholera. An outbreak swept through Brussels that autumn. Stéphanie, not yet 7 years old, fell desperately ill with typhus. For weeks she lay unconscious, burning with fever, her small body convulsing. The doctors warned the family to prepare for her death. But somehow, against all odds, she survived. She emerged from the illness changed, still a child, but one who had looked into the abyss. In 1875, her education began in earnest. She was tutored by strict disciplinarians who taught her French, German, English, and Hungarian. She learned history, literature, music, art, all the accomplishments expected of a future queen. The instruction was rigorous, often harsh, but Stéphanie proved an intelligent student. She absorbed knowledge eagerly, perhaps seeing education as a lifeline, a way to make sense of the chaos around her. That same year, her older sister Louise married and left the palace. Suddenly, at just 11 years old, Stéphanie found herself the highest-ranking female royal at the Belgian court whenever her mother was absent, which was often. Marie Henriette had begun retreating to the spa town of Spa in the Ardennes, seeking refuge from her miserable marriage. Stéphanie was left to navigate the formal dinners, the court ceremonies, the watchful eyes of nobles and diplomats, learning to perform royalty while still a child. She learned to curtsy perfectly, to keep her face neutral even when her heart was breaking, to smile at strangers and charm foreign dignitaries. She learned that a princess's feelings didn't matter, only her duty, her appearance, her usefulness to the state. By the time she turned 14, Stéphanie of Belgium had been shaped into precisely what her father wanted: a beautiful, accomplished, obedient young woman who could be traded to another royal house to advance Belgium's interests. She had no idea that the transaction was already underway. In the winter of 1878, a visitor arrived at the Belgian court, Empress Elizabeth of Austria, the legendary Sissi, wife of Emperor Franz Joseph, the first and one of the most famous women in Europe. Officially, she was passing through Brussels on her way to England. Unofficially, she had come to inspect a potential bride for her son. Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria-Hungary was 20 years old, the only son and heir of the vast Habsburg Empire. Charming, intelligent, and dangerously liberal in his political views, he was under immense pressure from his father to marry and produce an heir. The Empress, always concerned about bloodlines and beauty, had been searching for a suitable candidate. When she met 14-year-old Stéphanie, the encounter was brief and formal. The princess was allowed to kiss the Empress's hand and received a perfunctory embrace. Elizabeth's verdict, expressed later in private, was brutal. The girl was an ugly bumpkin, too plain and too provincial for her brilliant son. But Emperor Franz Joseph had different priorities. Stéphanie was Catholic, of appropriate rank, young enough to mold, and most importantly, available. The Belgian monarchy might be new and unproven, but it was wealthy, grotesquely wealthy, thanks to Leopold II's exploitation of the Congo. The negotiations moved forward, despite the Empress's objections. On March 4, 1880, Crown Prince Rudolph arrived in Brussels with an entourage of 21 people, including, though Stéphanie wouldn't learn this until later, his current mistress. The following day, March 5th, Stéphanie's father summoned her to his study. She would never forget what happened next. King Leopold II stood as she entered, his expression grave and cold. "The Crown Prince of Austria-Hungary has come here to ask for your hand in marriage," he told her in his deep, authoritative voice. "Your mother and I are very much in favor of this match. We have chosen you to be Empress of Austria and Queen of Hungary." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over her. "Go away, think about it, and give us your answer tomorrow." Stéphanie was 15 years old. She had met Rudolph once, briefly, at a formal reception. She knew almost nothing about him, except what she'd read in newspapers and heard in palace gossip. That night, she spoke with Tony, the only person she trusted. She spoke with her mother, who told her it would be her greatest happiness to become Austrian by marriage. But Stéphanie herself barely slept, turning the question over and over in her mind. Should I be capable of meeting the demands which would be made upon me? Was I to bind myself forever to a man whom I did not even know? In her memoirs, written decades later, she would reflect on that terrible night with bitter clarity. But at 15, trapped in a loveless family, raised to believe that duty was everything, she gave the only answer she could. Yes, the formal betrothal was announced on March 7, 1880. Rudolph presented her with an engagement ring, a large sapphire surrounded by diamonds. At the celebration dinner that followed, he spoke enthusiastically about his plans for Austria's future, about reform and progress. Stéphanie, desperate to be a good wife, hung on every word, trying to memorize his thoughts so she could become the companion he needed. But there were warning signs even then, if she had known how to read them. Rudolph was moody and distracted, his enthusiasm flickering and then dying like a candle in a draught. He drank heavily. He made jokes that cut just a little too close to cruelty. And when he left Brussels to return to Vienna, he took his mistress with him, not even bothering to hide her presence from his entourage. The wedding was originally scheduled for February 1881, but then came a humiliation so profound that Stéphanie would feel its sting for the rest of her life. She was sent to Vienna in advance to learn Austrian court etiquette. Within a month, her ladies-in-waiting discovered something shocking. At 16 years old, Stéphanie had not yet begun menstruating. She had not reached puberty. The wedding was immediately postponed. Stéphanie was sent back to Belgium in disgrace, the entire court whispering about her physical inadequacy. The postponement lasted 3 months, 3 months of shame, of waiting for her body to mature enough to fulfill its only important function. Finally, in May 1881, the marriage went forward. On May 10, 1881, 6 days before her 17th birthday, Princess Stéphanie of Belgium married Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria in a ceremony at the Augustiner Kirche in Vienna. The church was so packed with European royalty and nobility that the wedding procession could barely move through the crowd. Kings, Grand Dukes, Archdukes, and princes filled every pew, their uniforms glittering with medals, their wives dripping in jewels. Stéphanie wore white silk and lace, a diamond tiara, a veil that cascaded down her back like a waterfall. Rudolf wore the uniform of an Austrian field marshal, his chest covered in decorations. They spoke their vows. They exchanged rings. The bells of every church in Vienna rang out in celebration. Military bands played the anthems of both nations. The crowds in the streets cheered until they were hoarse. I was the crown princess of Austria-Hungary, Stéphanie would write, remembering that moment of triumph. But triumph lasted only hours. That night, alone with her new husband for the first time at Luxembourg Palace outside Vienna, Stéphanie discovered the truth of her marriage. The rooms they'd been given were cold, unwelcoming, barely furnished, as if no one had cared enough to prepare them properly. Rudolf, who had seemed charming in public, transformed the moment they were alone. He was rough, violent, contemptuous of her innocence. The next morning, Stéphanie wrote a desperate letter to her sister Louise. The words would haunt historians for generations. What a night! What torments! What horror! I had not had the ghost of a notion of what lay before me, but had been led to the altar as an ignorant child. My illusions, my youthful dreams were shattered. I thought I should die of my disillusionment. She was 17 years old. Her childhood was over, and she had just discovered that the fairy tale was a lie. At first, Stéphanie tried desperately to make the marriage work. She threw herself into her role as crown princess with the same discipline she'd applied to her studies as a child. Empress Elizabeth, who detested official functions, was often absent from Vienna, traveling endlessly through Europe. The burden of court duties fell to Stéphanie: the formal dinners, the receptions, the charity galas, the endless performances of imperial power. I had no rest, and was obliged to appear at all ceremonies, now here, now there. She wrote, "We had continually to show ourselves, smile, converse, hold receptions, accept invitations, attend festivals and theatrical performances." She was 17 years old and exhausted, playing empress while still learning to be a wife. In October 1881, just 5 months after the wedding, Stéphanie discovered she was pregnant. The news brought a brief thaw in her relationship with Rudolf. He became attentive again, almost tender. The emperor was overjoyed finally, an heir for the empire. Surely it would be a boy. It had to be a boy. On September 2nd, 1883, after a long and difficult labor, Stéphanie gave birth at Luxembourg Castle. The baby was healthy, beautiful, perfect in every way, except that she was a girl. They named her Elizabeth Marie, called Erzy within the family, a diminutive of the Hungarian form of Elizabeth. Rudolf received the news with barely concealed disappointment. The emperor hid his frustration behind formal congratulations. Even Empress Elizabeth, who famously avoided being called grandmother, showed only mild interest in the child. For Stéphanie, the birth should have been a triumph. She had produced an heir to the throne, albeit a female one. But Rudolf's interest in her evaporated almost immediately. He returned to his old patterns, staying out until dawn, drinking heavily, disappearing for days at a time to his hunting lodges. And he returned to his mistresses. What Stéphanie didn't know, what no one told her, was that Rudolf had contracted sexually, transmitted diseases from his numerous affairs. Most historians believe he carried both syphilis and gonorrhea, infections that were slowly poisoning his body and mind. In order to recover his health, Rudolf took a trip to the island of Lochram in the Adriatic, and he brought Stéphanie with him. It was presented as a romantic getaway, a chance for the couple to reconnect. But Rudolf's true purpose was treatment for his diseases, treatment that no one explained to his wife. When Stéphanie began experiencing symptoms herself, pain, fever, gynecological problems, the court doctors lied to her face. They told her she was suffering from peritonitis, an inflammation of the abdominal lining. They gave her treatments that did nothing. They assured her she would recover. The truth was far more sinister. Rudolf had infected his wife with the same diseases he'd contracted from prostitutes and actresses. The infections ravaged her reproductive system. When she and Rudolf tried to conceive again, hoping for a male heir, Stéphanie discovered the devastating truth. At 22 years old, she was sterile. She would never have another child. When she finally learned what her husband had done to her, that he had knowingly or unknowingly transmitted venereal disease to her, destroying her fertility and condemning her to a life without the son the empire desperately needed, Stéphanie's feelings toward Rudolf curdled into something darker than hatred. She felt betrayed, violated, broken in a way that could never be repaired. She refused to share his bed ever again. Their marriage became a performance maintained for public consumption, but hollow at its core. Rudolf would stumble home at dawn, reeking of alcohol and perfume, and find his wife's door locked against him. Stéphanie would sit alone in her chambers, consumed by resentment and the knowledge that her greatest failure, her inability to produce a male heir, was her husband's fault. The court whispered, the newspapers speculated, and Rudolf, drowning in his own misery and guilt, spiraled deeper into debauchery. In the summer of 1887, during an official visit to the Kingdom of Galicia and Lodomeria, Stéphanie met Count Artur Władysław Potocki. He was a Polish nobleman, 37 years old, widowed since 1881, when his young wife had died in childbirth. He was a chamberlain at the Austrian court, a member of the House of Lords, wealthy, cultured, and most importantly kind to her. For the first time since her marriage, Stéphanie felt seen as something other than a failed breeding vessel. Their affair was discreet. Unlike Rudolf, who flaunted his mistresses, Stéphanie was careful. She gave Potocki the code name Hamlet and used her sister Louise as a go-between to arrange meetings. For 18 months, the relationship gave her something to live for, proof that she could still be desired, still be valued, still feel something other than despair. But Rudolf was deteriorating rapidly. In October 1888, Stéphanie returned from a trip to Greece and was shocked by her husband's appearance. "I was horrified as soon as I set eyes on the crown prince," she wrote in her memoirs. His decay was so greatly advanced as to have become conspicuous. He was frightfully changed. His skin was flaccid. His eyes were restless. His expression had completely changed. It seemed as if a process of internal dissolution were going on. Terrified, Stéphanie went to her father-in-law, Emperor Franz Joseph, and begged him to help Rudolf, to save him from whatever darkness was consuming him. The emperor dismissed her concerns. Rudolf was under stress, he said. He would recover. There was nothing to worry about. 3 months later, Rudolf was dead. On January 29, 1889, the imperial family hosted a dinner party before the emperor and empress were to leave for Budapest. Crown Prince Rudolf attended, but he was distracted, pale, his hands trembling. He made his excuses early and left for his hunting lodge at Mayerling, a secluded estate in the Vienna woods, 15 miles southwest of the capital. He took with him Baroness Mary Vitsera, a 17-year-old girl who had become infatuated with him the previous year. She was young, romantic, obsessed with literature and the idea of dying for love. Rudolf had proposed suicide pacts to other women before, to his former mistress Misi Kasper, who had laughed and then gone to the police in concern. But Mary said yes. On the morning of January 30th, 1889, Rudolf's valet, Johann Laschek, went to wake the crown prince for the day's scheduled hunt. There was no answer when he knocked. Count Joseph Hoyos, Rudolf's hunting companion, joined him. Still no response. They tried to force the door, but it wouldn't give. Finally, Laschek smashed through a door panel with a hammer and reached through to unlock it from the inside. The room was shuttered, half dark. Rudolf sat motionless beside the bed, leaning forward, blood dried on his mouth and temple. On the bed lay Mary Vetsera, rigor mortis already set in. She had been shot in the head hours earlier. Rudolf had then turned his revolver on himself. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire was dead at 30 years old. The girl he'd taken with him was just 17. Stéphanie was one of the last to learn the news. No one wanted to tell her. When officials finally informed her, she maintained an icy composure that her in-laws interpreted as coldness rather than shock. Behind closed doors, she wrote later, she was collapsing inwardly, not from love, for that had died years ago, but from the sheer weight of what Rudolf's death meant for her future. Rudolf left her a letter, coldly formal. Dear Stéphanie, you are freed from my presence and vexation. Be happy in your fashion. Be good to the poor little one, who is the only thing that remains of me. At 24 years old, Stéphanie was a widow. She was sterile, unable to remarry and produce children. She was trapped at the Austrian court, where she was now blamed whispered about, accused of failing to provide Rudolf with the emotional support he needed, condemned for not being beautiful enough or warm enough to keep him alive. She wanted desperately to leave Vienna, to return home to Brussels, to escape the court that had never wanted her. But neither her father, King Leopold II, nor her father-in-law, Emperor Franz Joseph, would permit it. Her daughter Ursi was a Habsburg archduchess, and the emperor refused to let his granddaughter leave Austria. As Ursi's guardian, he demanded that Stéphanie remain as well. She was a prisoner in a foreign country, living in a palace that felt like a tomb. During this unbearable time, one person remained by her side, Count Artur Potocki, her Hamlet. He stood by her through the scandal, through the investigations, through the whispers and accusations. For Stéphanie, he was her only anchor in a world that had capsized. But fate was not finished with her yet. In early 1890, barely a year after Rudolf's death, Potocki developed symptoms of laryngeal cancer. The disease moved quickly. Surgery was attempted to remove the tumor, but it failed, leaving him unable to speak. Stéphanie sat by his bedside as the man she truly loved died slowly, painfully, his voice stolen from him, his body wasting away. On March 1890, Count Artur Potocki died. He was not yet 40 years old. I have lost my best friend, Stéphanie wrote to her sister Louise. In the space of 14 months, she had lost her husband, her position, her purpose, and the only man who had ever truly loved her. She was 25 years old and felt ancient. The Austrian court offered her no comfort. Empress Elizabeth avoided her completely. Emperor Franz Joseph was polite but distant. Stéphanie was stripped of most of her official duties and forbidden from representing the Empress at functions. She retained the title of Dowager Crown Princess, but it was an empty honor. She was, in every way that mattered, irrelevant. For the next 10 years, she lived in this limbo, traveling when permitted, spending time with her daughter when allowed, but always returning to the cold halls of the Hofburg Palace in Vienna, where she had no place and no future. Then, in the late 1890s, she met a Hungarian count named Elemer Lányé. Count Elemer Lányé de Nagy Lányé et Vasárós Nemeni was born on August 24, 1863, making him just 1 year older than Stéphanie. He came from an old Hungarian noble family, though of lower rank than the Habsburgs. He was Protestant, cultured, diplomatic. He had worked in embassies in Bucharest, St. Petersburg, and Brussels. In 1890, he had been appointed chamberlain at the Austrian court, which is how he and Stéphanie first met. Their relationship developed slowly, carefully. By 1899, Stéphanie realized she was in love, truly in love, perhaps for the first time in her life. Lányé offered her something she had never had before: genuine partnership, respect, kindness without cruelty. But there were problems, enormous problems. Lányé was Protestant. He was of significantly lower rank than Stéphanie, and marrying him would mean forfeiting her imperial titles, her position at court, possibly even her relationship with her daughter. Stéphanie knew her father, King Leopold II, would never approve. So she took an unusual step. In October 1899, she wrote to Queen Victoria of England, the grandmother of Europe, asking for her support. Victoria, who had always been sympathetic to Stéphanie after Mayerling, wrote to Leopold II on her behalf. It backfired spectacularly. King Leopold II was furious. How dare his daughter go behind his back? How dare she seek to marry a Protestant of lower rank? He responded to Stéphanie in the severest and harshest terms, refusing absolutely to give his consent. He even sent an angry letter to Queen Victoria, telling her to stay out of Belgian family matters. The Belgian royal family severed all contact with Stéphanie. They forbade her to return to Belgium. Leopold II even tried to strip her of her title of Royal Highness, though court lawyers informed him it was legally impossible. For the second time in her life, Stéphanie's father had sold her, but this time she refused to be bought. On March 22, 1900, at Miramare Castle on the Adriatic coast, Princess Stéphanie of Belgium married Count Elimer Lanier. She had been a widow for 11 years. She was 35 years old. The marriage cost her everything. She lost her title of Dowager Crown Princess and was no longer permitted to use Imperial and Royal Highness. Her daughter Elizabeth Marie, furious at what she saw as a betrayal of her dead father's memory, broke off all contact with her mother. Emperor Franz Joseph, though he had reluctantly given permission for the marriage, provided Stéphanie with an annual pension of 100,000 guilders, but made clear that she was no longer truly part of the Habsburg family. The Austrian press was divided. Some newspapers condemned her for lowering herself, but others saw romance in the match. The journal Die Presse wrote that there was a certain marvelous romanticism in the act, and noted that Stéphanie had chosen personal happiness over imperial power. For the first time in her life, Stéphanie didn't care what anyone thought. In 1906, Stéphanie and Elimer purchased Orashvur Castle, later called Rusovs, in Hungary, an estate spanning over 2,400 hectares with magnificent gardens. Stéphanie threw herself into designing the grounds, planting flower beds, creating walking paths. She became, as one biographer wrote, at the same time a lord, mistress of the house, manager of the estate, garden architect, and hostess. It was a peaceful life, the kind of life she had never imagined possible during her years in the Austrian court. She and Elimer traveled extensively, visited with other exiled royals, maintained a circle of intellectuals and artists. When World War I broke out in 1914, triggered in part by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the man who might have married Stéphanie if circumstances had been different, they watched the old order collapse from their quiet corner of Hungary. In 1917, the new Emperor of Austria-Hungary, Charles I, elevated Elimer to the rank of Prince first, with the style of Serene Highness. It was a small gesture, but it meant that Stéphanie's second marriage had finally been recognized as somewhat less unequal. Then, on December 11, 1909, her father King Leopold II died in Brussels. He died hated by his own people, who booed his funeral cortege in the streets punishment for the horrors he had inflicted in the Congo, where between 5 and 15 million Congolese had died under his brutal regime. After his death, Stéphanie and her sister Louise attempted to claim their inheritance, the billions Leopold had extracted from Congo blood. They lost the case. The fortune was kept by the Belgian state, and the sisters received almost nothing. In 1935, at the age of 71, Stéphanie published her memoirs under the title I Was to Be Empress. The book was scandalous, filled with bitter revelations about Rudolph's cruelty, the coldness of the Habsburg court, the lies she'd been told about her own body. It was censored in Austria. Her daughter Elizabeth Marie sued her over its contents. The rift between mother and daughter, already wide, became permanent. In 1934, Stéphanie disinherited Elizabeth Marie entirely, leaving everything to the Benedictine order instead. Her daughter had divorced her first husband, Prince Otto zu Windisch-Gries, and married Leopold Petznick, a socialist, a union Stéphanie found unforgivable. When World War II came to Hungary in 1944, Stéphanie and Elmer tried to maintain their quiet life at Russo's. But in April 1945, the Red Army arrived. A German SS officer commandeered most of their castle, forcing the elderly couple into just a few rooms. On April 2nd, Soviet troops reached the mansion. Stéphanie was 80 years old and suffering from heart disease. She and Elmer fled, finding refuge in the Pannonhalma Archabbey, a Benedictine monastery in Hungary. On August 23, 1945, 3 months after arriving at the abbey, Princess Stéphanie of Belgium died of a stroke. Her daughter Elizabeth Marie was not at her funeral. None of her descendants attended. She was buried in the crypt of Pannonhalma Archabbey, next to the husband she had chosen, the man who had finally given her a taste of happiness. Less than a year later, on July 29, 1946, Elmer Lanier joined her in death. They were buried side by side. Princess Stéphanie of Belgium lived 81 years. She was born into unimaginable wealth, married into one of Europe's greatest empires, and was destined to become Empress of Austria-Hungary. But instead, she became something else entirely, a woman who survived. She survived a violent wedding night and a marriage built on lies. She survived being infected with diseases that stole her fertility and destroyed her chance at fulfilling her only dynastic purpose. She survived the shock of Mayerling, the scandal, the accusations, the loss of 3 people she loved within 14 months. She survived being trapped in a foreign court where she was blamed for her husband a suicide and stripped of almost everything she had, and in the end she escaped. When she married Elmer Lanier in 1900, she gave up her imperial titles, her imperial future, the chance that her daughter might one day forgive her. But she chose happiness over duty. She chose love over power. And for 45 years, until the Red Army arrived at her doorstep, she lived the quiet life she had always wanted. History remembers Rudolph, the tragic crown prince who died at Mayerling. History remembers Mary Vetsera, the doomed teenager who loved him. But history has largely forgotten Stéphanie, the woman who lived, who endured, who rebuilt her life from the wreckage of imperial ambition. She was supposed to be empress. Instead, she became something more valuable, herself. Her grave in Pannonhalma Archabbey bears a simple inscription, far from the grand monuments of the Habsburgs in Vienna, far from the cold halls of the Hofburg, where she spent her most miserable years. She rests beside the man she chose in the quiet she earned. A woman who, even in the end, lived precisely as she wished, and whose story still leaves us wondering what price is too high for freedom, for love, for the simple right to choose your own life.